Hello, my name is Emily Wiggins, and I am in the Human Anatomy and Physiology class, Bio 139, and this is my muscle movements project. The first muscle is the trapezius muscle, and it's here on the top of the shoulder, and it runs down the back. It is broken down into superior, middle, and inferior. The main movement is shoulder elevation, retraction of the scapula, and depression of the scapula. The concentric movement or shortening movement is shoulder elevation, and the eccentric movement or stretching movement is depression of the scapula. The forceful movement is upward rotation of the scapula, and the stretching movement is putting the arm back down. The joint name is the shoulder joint or acromioclavicle joint. The proper directional movement terms is to elevate, rotation of the scapula, retraction, and depression of the scapula. The two bones is the occipital bone here at the bottom of the skull, and the lower thoracic vertebrae of the spine to the spine of the scapula. The point of origin, or the stationary point, is the superior nuchal line of the occipital bone, and the insertion, or the moving portion, is along the acromion and the spine of the scapula and the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. The next muscle is the sartorius muscle, and it runs down the length of the leg from the outer hip to the inner knee. The main movement is crossing your legs when you're in a seated position, the concentric movement during leg extension, and eccentric during leg flexion. The forceful movement is when you bring up a straight leg, and the stretching movement is holding your foot behind your back. The joint name is the tibiofemoral joint, and the proper directional movement term is hip flexion, knee flexion, and hip abduction. The two bones for this muscle is the iliac, or the outer portion of the hip bone, and the tibia. The point of origin is the anterior iliac spine, and the insertion points is the tibia. The next muscle is the tensor fasciae latae, or a muscle on the outer hip. The main movement is walking, and this abducts your thigh and medially rotates your thigh. The concentric motion is during abduction, and the eccentric motion is during adduction and lateral flexion. The forceful movement would be a side leg lift, and the stretching movement would be putting the leg back down and bending in the opposite direction. The joint name is the acetabulofemoral joint, and the proper directional movement terms are hip flexion, medial rotation, abduction, lateral rotation. The two bones are the hip bone, or the coxa, and it connects to the iliotibial tract, or IT band, which then connects to the greater trochanter of the femur. The point of origin is the anterior superior iliac spine, which is here on the hip bone, and the insertion point is the iliotibial tract, or the IT band. The next muscle is the latissimus dorsi, which is a back muscle, and the main is here, and the main movement is arm abduction. The concentric movement is when the arm is down, and eccentric is when the arm is raised. Forceful movement when lifting the arm, and stretching movement when putting the arm back down. The joint is the shoulder joint, or glenohumeral joint, And the proper directional movement terms are extension, adduction, and transverse extension. The two bones are the spine and the humerus. This muscle connects to the back of the arm. The point of origin is the spinous process of vertebrae T7 through L5, and the insertion point is the intertubercular groove of the humerus, or on the back of the arm. The next muscle is the gastrocnemius, which is a calf muscle. And the main movement is it flexes your leg. The concentric movement is during flexion of the leg, and the eccentric movement is during extension of the leg. The forceful movement is when you bend the leg, and the stretching movement is when you're putting the leg back down. The joint name is the knee joint or the patellofemoral joint. The proper directional movement term is flexion and extension. The two bones are the femur and the calcaneus, or the heel bone. And the point of origin is the superior surfaces of the lateral and medial condyle of the femur. The insertion point is the calcaneus. The next muscle is the extensor digitorum longus, which runs down the front of the leg on the outer side of the fibula, and it connects to a tendon which moves all the toes. The main movement is moving toes 2 through 5. The concentric movement is dorsiflexion of the foot, and the eccentric movement is extension of the foot, or plantar flexion of the foot. The forceful movement is raising the foot, just the foot, and the stretching movement is lowering the foot back down to the floor. The joint name is the ankle joint or talocrural joint. The proper directional terms are dorsal flexion or plantar flexion. The two bones that this muscle connects to is the fibula and the phalanges. The point of origin is the lateral condyle of the tibia, anterior surface of the fibula, and the interosus membrane, which connects these two bones. The insertion point is the distal phalanges of toes 2 through 5. The next muscle is the flexor carpi radialis, which when you're in anatomical position runs down the middle of the arm. The main movement is wrist flexion. The concentric movement would be flexion of the hand, and the eccentric movement would be hyperextension of the hand. The forceful movement is lowering the hand, and the stretching movement is raising the hand. The joint name is the wrist joint or the distal radial ulnar joint. The proper directional terms is flexion, extension, and hyperextension. The two bones are the humerus and the metacarpals. The point of origin is the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and the insertion point is the base of metacarpals 2 and 3. The next muscle is the rectus femoris, which runs down the middle of your thigh. And the main movement is to flex the leg and extend the leg. The concentric movement would be extension of the leg, and the eccentric movement would be flexion of the leg. The forceful movement is straightening the leg, and the stretching movement would be bending at the knee. The joint name is the hip joint or the acetabulofemoral joint. The proper directional movement terms is flexion or extension. The two bones are the hip bone and the patella. The point of origin is the anterior inferior iliac spine, and the insertion point is the patellar tendon. The next muscle is the tibialis anterior, the front of your shin on the lateral side. And the main movement is it helps with dorsal flexion, which is lifting the foot. The concentric movement is dorsiflexion, and the eccentric movement is inversion of the foot, which is lifting only the big toe side of your foot, turning it outwards. The forceful movement is lifting the foot, and the stretching movement is extending the foot. The joint name is the ankle joint or the talocrural joint. The proper directional terms are dorsiflexion and inversion of the foot. The two bones are the tibia and the fibula, which are the two bones of the lower leg. The point of origin is the lateral condyle of the tibia, and the insertion point is the metatarsal one and the first cuneiform bone. The next muscle is the deltoid muscle, which is here at the top of your arm. The main movement is movement of the arm. Concentric movement is abduction of the arm, and the eccentric movement is adduction of the arm. The forceful movement would be raising the arm, and the stretching movement would be putting the arm back down. The joint name is the shoulder joint or the glenohumeral joint. The proper directional terms are flexion and extension. The two bones are actually three bones, is the clavicle, the scapula, and the humerus. The point of origin is the clavicle, scapula, and humerus, and the insertion point is the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. The muscle of my choice and the last muscle on this video is the sternocleidomastoid, which is here on the neck. It is broken down into unilateral and bilateral movements. Unilateral means it only uses one side, bilateral means it uses both sides. It is unilateral movement when you're rotating the head from one side or to the other, and it is bilateral during neck flexion or looking down. That one uses both. So concentric movement is during flexion of the neck or looking down, and an eccentric during extension or hyperextension of the neck, which is looking forward or looking up. Forceful movement is looking down. Stretching movement is looking up or rotating the head to either side. The joint name is the atlanto-occipital joint, which is here on the back of the skull, and the atlantoaxial joint, which is just below the atlanto-occipital joint, and this is for head rotation. The proper directional terms are flexion, extension, hyperextension, and rotation. The two bones are the mastoid process, or the bottom notch on the skull, the manubrium, which is the top of the sternum, and the sternal end of the clavicle, which is the medial portion of the clavicle bone. The point of origin is the manubrium and sternal end of the clavicle, and the insertion point is the mastoid process.